The conference room fell silent as the SEAL Admiral's mocking laughter echoed off the walls. "A major? You?" He looked at the young woman standing before him, a single mother who'd barely made it to the morning briefing on time. This has to be some kind of joke. But what he didn't know was that the woman wearing civilian clothes, juggling a coffee cup in her daughter's forgotten lunchbox, held a secret that would bring a decorated admiral to his knees. Her true rank wasn't just impressive, it was terrifying. And the two-star general standing behind him was about to make sure he understood exactly who he'd just humiliated. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters in Stuttgart, Germany, as Irene Hill rushed through the main gates at precisely 0753 hours. She was late. Again. Her daughter Emma's daycare had called with yet another minor emergency, a forgotten permission slip for a field trip, and Irene had spent 20 precious minutes racing back to their small apartment to retrieve it. Now, she hurried across the courtyard, her civilian clothes, a simple navy blazer and khaki pants, drawing curious glances from the uniformed personnel streaming toward the main building. In her left hand, she clutched a travel mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. In her right, Emma's pink lunchbox dangled, a forgotten artifact from the morning's chaos that she'd have to deal with later. Irene was 32 years old, though the stress of single motherhood and her demanding work often made her feel twice that age. She'd been stationed at the Stuttgart facility for 8 months, working in what most people understood to be a civilian liaison position coordinating logistics between NATO forces and American Special Operations units. It was quiet work, administrative work, the kind of position that kept her off the radar and allowed her to maintain some semblance of a normal life for her daughter. What no one at the facility knew, what no one could know, was that Irene Hill wasn't actually a civilian logistics coordinator. She was Major Irene Hill, United States Army Intelligence, working deep cover on a classified operation that had been running for 14 months. Her civilian position was an elaborate front that allowed her to observe, document, and report on potential security breaches within the special operations community without drawing attention to herself. She'd requested this assignment specifically because it was supposed to be low risk, the kind of intelligence work that would let her be present in her daughter's life while still serving her country. After her husband Daniel, also Army intelligence, had been killed in action 3 years ago, Irene had seriously considered leaving the military entirely. But her superiors had convinced her that her skills were too valuable, her instincts too sharp, to lose. So they'd created this position, this identity, this carefully constructed fiction that allowed her to do meaningful work while raising Emma alone. The morning briefing was scheduled to start at 0800 in Conference Room A large space typically reserved for high-level coordination meetings between different military branches. Irene rarely attended these briefings, her civilian status usually excluded her from operational discussions, but she'd received a cryptic email the previous evening requesting her presence. No explanation, just a time and location. She slipped into the conference room at 0759, hoping to find a seat in the back where she could observe without drawing attention. Instead, she found herself walking into a room full of high-ranking officers, all in full dress uniform, all turning to stare at the breathless woman in civilian clothes carrying a child's lunchbox. "Can we help you?" A voice from the front of the room cut through the sudden silence. It belonged to a man Irene recognized immediately, Rear Admiral Thomas Whitmore, a legendary SEAL operator with 3 decades of service and a reputation for being both brilliant and brutal. He stood at the podium, his uniform decorated with enough medals and ribbons to tell a story of countless operations across multiple theaters of war. Irene straightened her shoulders, acutely aware of how she must look rumpled, late, carrying a pink lunchbox covered in cartoon unicorns. "I received a request to attend this briefing, sir. I'm Irene Hill, civilian liaison for NATO coordination." Admiral Whitmore's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like amusement. "The civilian coordinator? Someone must have made a mistake. This is a classified operational briefing, not a logistics meeting. With respect, sir, I received specific instructions to be here." Irene held up her phone, showing the email, though she knew from this distance he couldn't read it. Whitmore glanced at his aide, a young lieutenant who was frantically scrolling through a tablet. The lieutenant shrugged helplessly. "Sir, her name is on the list. It says she holds a major's rank and should be included in all operational briefings." The room erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Admiral Whitmore's face split into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "A major? You?" He looked Irene up and down, his gaze lingering on the lunchbox. "Is this some kind of joke?" Irene felt heat rising in her cheeks but kept her voice level. "Sir, I'm just following the instructions I received." "Following instructions?" Whitmore repeated, his tone dripping with condescension. "Tell me, Major," he said the rank like it was a punchline, "did those instructions include bringing your daughter's lunch to a classified military briefing? Or is that standard protocol in whatever fantasy world gave you that rank?" More laughter rippled through the room. Irene recognized several of the officers present, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Air Force Special Tactics, all elite operators who'd earned their positions through years of grueling service. To them, she was just another paper pusher, someone who'd probably been given an honorary rank for administrative convenience. "I apologize for the lunchbox, sir," Irene said quietly. "It was a hectic morning." "I'm sure it was," Whitmore replied, his voice heavy with mock sympathy. "Single motherhood must be very challenging. Which is exactly why we don't put people juggling daycare schedules in positions of actual authority. The military isn't a kindergarten, Ms. Hill." The use of Ms. instead of her rank, even the fake rank on the roster, was a deliberate insult. Irene had faced dismissal before, had dealt with officers who couldn't see past her gender or her circumstances, but something about Whitmore's casual cruelty struck deeper. Maybe it was the exhaustion from another sleepless night. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 8 months spent pretending to be less than she was. Or maybe it was just that his words hit too close to the constant guilt she felt about balancing her duty to her country with her duty to her daughter. "If there's been a mistake with the roster, I can leave," Irene offered, hating how small her voice sounded. "That would probably be best," Whitmore agreed. "Though I'd like to know which incompetent administrator thought it was appropriate to list a civilian daycare coordinator as a major. That's the kind of paperwork error that undermines the integrity of the entire rank structure." He turned to address the room at large. "Let this be a lesson, gentlemen. This is what happens when we let bureaucracy and political correctness infiltrate military operations. Next thing you know, we'll be taking tactical advice from soccer moms." Irene stood frozen in the doorway, the Admiral's words echoing in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to defend herself, to explain that his assumption was based on a carefully constructed cover that he had no clearance to question. But revealing her true position would compromise months of intelligence work and potentially endanger ongoing operations. So she did what she'd been trained to do, she absorbed the humiliation and prepared to leave. She was turning toward the exit when another voice cut through the room, this one carrying an authority that made even Admiral Whitmore's commanding presence seem diminished. "Admiral Whitmore." The voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried the kind of weight that stopped conversations mid-sentence. "Would you mind explaining to me why you're preventing one of my officers from attending a briefing she was specifically ordered to attend?" Every head in the room turned toward the back corner, where a man in an army dress uniform had been sitting so quietly that most people hadn't noticed his presence. He stood now, and the 2 stars on his shoulder boards caught the morning light streaming through the windows. Major General Robert Keating was not a man who made casual appearances at operational briefings. As the Deputy Commander of Special Operations Command Europe, he oversaw classified programs across multiple countries and had direct authority over intelligence operations that most of the officers in this room would never know existed. He was also one of only 3 people in the entire theater who knew Irene Hill's true identity and mission. Admiral Whitmore's confident smirk faltered. "General Keating. I wasn't aware you were attending this briefing." "Clearly." Keating moved toward the front of the room with measured steps, his presence commanding attention despite his relatively slight build. "You were too busy mocking one of your fellow officers to notice much of anything." With respect, General, that woman is a civilian coordinator, not an officer. Is that so? Keating's tone remained mild, almost curious. What gave you that impression? Whitmore gestured at Irene, who remained standing near the door, still holding Emma's lunchbox. She's wearing civilian clothes, carrying a child's lunch, and shows up late to a classified briefing. She clearly doesn't understand basic military protocol. I see. Keating turned to look at Irene, and for a brief moment, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Major Hill, would you please show Admiral Whitmore your identification? The room went silent. Irene reached into her blazer pocket and withdrew a leather credential case. She walked forward, every step feeling like it covered miles, and handed it to Admiral Whitmore. He opened it, and Irene watched the color drain from his face. The identification inside wasn't the standard military ID she'd been using for the past 8 months. It was her actual credentials, Major Irene Hill, United States Army Intelligence, with security clearances that exceeded everyone's in the room except for General Keating himself. I don't understand, Whitmore said, his voice suddenly uncertain. She's been working as a civilian liaison. For 8 months. Has she? Keating's question hung in the air like a challenge. Or has she been conducting a classified intelligence operation that required her to maintain a civilian cover? An operation that you, Admiral, don't have clearance to know the details of? Whitmore looked from the credentials to Irene's face, then back to the credentials, as if trying to reconcile the harried single mother with the highly classified security clearances in his hands. This is. I had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing, Keating interrupted, his voice hardening. Her name was on the briefing roster with her rank clearly indicated. You chose to assume that was an error rather than question your own assumptions. You chose to humiliate a fellow officer based on her appearance and circumstances rather than treat her with the respect her rank and service deserve. The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. Some had laughed at Whitmore's jokes. Others had remained silent but hadn't intervened. Now they were all complicit in the public humiliation of someone who outranked many of them. Keating turned to address the room at large. Major Hill has been running one of the most successful intelligence operations in this theater for over a year. She's identified 3 potential security breaches, prevented 2 classified leaks, and provided actionable intelligence that has directly supported missions some of you have participated in. She's done all of this while maintaining a cover that required her to endure exactly the kind of dismissal and condescension that Admiral Whitmore just demonstrated. He paused, letting that information sink in. She's also done all of this while raising her daughter alone after losing her husband, Captain Daniel Hill, also Army Intelligence, who was killed in action while conducting a classified operation 3 years ago. An operation that earned him a posthumous Silver Star that his family couldn't even be told the details of. Irene felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. She hadn't wanted her personal tragedy used as a weapon in this confrontation, but she understood Keating's strategy. He was systematically dismantling every assumption Whitmore had made, every casual dismissal, every mocking comment. Admiral Whitmore's face had gone from pale to ashen. General, I had no idea. The classification levels. I should have been briefed. Should you have? Keating's question was pointed. Should every officer in this facility be briefed on every classified operation happening under their nose? Or should they trust that their fellow officers are where they're supposed to be, doing what they're supposed to do, regardless of how they dress or what personal items they happen to be carrying? Whitmore had no answer. He stood holding Irene's credentials like they were burning his hands, the weight of his mistakes settling over him with visible force. Major Hill, Keating said, his tone becoming formal. Please take your seat. This briefing concerns an operation where your intelligence will be critical. Admiral Whitmore, I believe you owe Major Hill an apology before we proceed. The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was on Whitmore, watching to see how a decorated SEAL admiral would handle this moment of public correction. Irene could see the struggle playing out across his face, pride warring with professionalism, ego fighting against the irrefutable evidence of his error. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Admiral Whitmore stood at the front of the conference room, Irene's credentials still clutched in his hands, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of boots marching across the courtyard outside. Finally, he cleared his throat and turned to face Irene directly. "Major Hill." His voice had lost all its earlier mockery, replaced by something that sounded almost hollow. "I owe you an apology. My comments were inappropriate, unprofessional, and completely out of line. I made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts, and I disrespected both your rank and your service." Irene nodded curtly, accepting the apology, though the words did little to erase the humiliation she'd felt moments before. "Thank you, Admiral." But Keating wasn't finished. "Admiral Whitmore, I think you're missing the broader point here. This isn't just about one inappropriate comment at one briefing. Major Hill has been stationed at this facility for 8 months. 8 months during which she's been treated as little more than a secretary by most of the personnel here, including you. She's been excluded from operational discussions, had her expertise dismissed, and been relegated to administrative tasks that have nothing to do with her actual mission." He walked to the front of the room, standing beside Irene in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone present. The reason her cover worked so well is because it played into everyone's preconceived notions. Single mother? Must not be serious about her career. "I don't understand," Whitmore said, his voice suddenly uncertain. "She's been working as a civilian liaison. For 8 months. Has she?" Keating's question hung in the air like a challenge. "Or has she been conducting a classified intelligence operation that required her to maintain a civilian cover? An operation that you, Admiral, don't have clearance to know the details of?" Whitmore looked from the credentials to Irene's face, then back to the credentials, as if trying to reconcile the harried single mother with the highly classified security clearances in his hands. "This is. I had no way of knowing." "You had every way of knowing," Keating interrupted, his voice hardening. "Her name was on the briefing roster with her rank clearly indicated. You chose to assume that was an error rather than question your own assumptions. You chose to humiliate a fellow officer based on her appearance and circumstances rather than treat her with the respect her rank and service deserve." The other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. Some had laughed at Whitmore's jokes. Others had remained silent but hadn't intervened. Now they were all complicit in the public humiliation of someone who outranked many of them. Keating turned to address the room at large. "Major Hill has been running one of the most successful intelligence operations in this theater for over a year. She's identified 3 potential security breaches, prevented 2 classified leaks, and provided actionable intelligence that has directly supported missions some of you have participated in. She's done all of this while maintaining a cover that required her to endure exactly the kind of dismissal and condescension that Admiral Whitmore just demonstrated." He paused, letting that information sink in. "She's also done all of this while raising her daughter alone after losing her husband, Captain Daniel Hill, also Army intelligence, who was killed in action while conducting a classified operation 3 years ago. A operation that earned him a posthumous Silver Star that his family couldn't even be told the details of." Irene felt tears prick at her eyes but refused to let them fall. She hadn't wanted her personal tragedy used as a weapon in this confrontation, but she understood Keating's strategy. He was systematically dismantling every assumption Whitmore had made, every casual dismissal, every mocking comment. Admiral Whitmore's face had gone from pale to ashen. "General, I had no idea. The classification levels. I should have been briefed." "Should you have?" Keating's question was pointed. "Should every officer in this facility be briefed on every classified operation happening under their nose? Or should they trust that their fellow officers are where they're supposed to be, doing what they're supposed to do, regardless of how they dress or what personal items they happen to be carrying?" Whitmore had no answer. He stood holding Irene's credentials like they were burning his hands, the weight of his mistake settling over him with visible force. "Major Hill," Keating said, his tone becoming formal. "Please take your seat. This briefing concerns an operation where your intelligence will be critical. Admiral Whitmore, I believe you owe Major Hill an apology before we proceed." The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was on Whitmore, watching to see how a decorated SEAL admiral would handle this moment of public correction. Irene could see the struggle playing out across his face, pride warring with professionalism, ego fighting against the irrefutable evidence of his error. "We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative." Admiral Whitmore stood at the front of the conference room, Irene's credentials still clutched in his hands, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the distant sound of boots marching across the courtyard outside. Finally, he cleared his throat and turned to face Irene directly. "Major Hill." His voice had lost all its earlier mockery, replaced by something that sounded almost hollow. "I owe you an apology. My comments were inappropriate, unprofessional, and completely out of line. I made assumptions based on appearance rather than facts, and I disrespected both your rank and your service." Irene nodded curtly, accepting the apology, though the words did little to erase the humiliation she'd felt moments before. "Thank you, Admiral." But Keating wasn't finished. "Admiral Whitmore, I think you're missing the broader point here. This isn't just about one inappropriate comment at one briefing. Major Hill has been stationed at this facility for 8 months. 8 months during which she's been treated as little more than a secretary by most of the personnel here, including you. She's been excluded from operational discussions, had her expertise dismissed, and been relegated to administrative tasks that have nothing to do with her actual mission." He walked to the front of the room, standing beside Irene in a gesture of solidarity that wasn't lost on anyone present. The reason her cover worked so well is because it played into everyone's preconceived notions. Single mother? Must not be serious about her career. Over the past 14 months, I've documented 47 instances of classified information appearing in unauthorized channels, she began, her voice steady and professional. The leaks follow a pattern. They occur primarily after large operational briefings, suggest insider knowledge of personnel movements, and include details that only someone with direct access to mission planning would know. She pulled up a series of charts showing the correlation between briefings and leaks. Initially, we suspected the breach might be electronic, someone hacking our communications systems or installing monitoring equipment. But my analysis suggests the leak is human. Someone in this facility is deliberately passing information to outside parties. Admiral Whitmore leaned forward, his earlier embarrassment temporarily forgotten in the face of this operational crisis. "Do you have suspects?" "I've narrowed it to a pool of 12 people who have the necessary access, opportunity, and in some cases, potential motivation," Irene replied. She pulled up a list of names, faces that everyone in the room would recognize. 3 are civilian contractors with financial difficulties. 4 are military personnel who've recently been passed over for promotion. 5 are support staff who have access to classified areas but aren't typically scrutinized closely. Colonel Vance studied the list with a frown. "That's a wide range. How do we narrow it further without tipping off the suspect?" "That's where my cover becomes useful again," Irene said. "As a civilian coordinator, I have legitimate reasons to interact with all of these individuals. I can conduct interviews under the guise of administrative reviews, cross-reference their schedules with leak timings, and observe their behaviors without raising suspicion." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed operational plan. "However, we need to accelerate the investigation. The latest intercepts suggest that whoever is leaking information is planning something bigger. Within the next 2 weeks, there's a major operation scheduled, one that could be seriously compromised if the leak continues." General Keating crossed his arms, studying the information displayed on the screen. "Major Hill is proposing that we use the upcoming operation as bait. We'll create false information suggesting a high-value target and specific timing, then see if that information appears in our intercepts. If it does, we'll know our leak is active and we can narrow down who had access to the false intelligence. The room erupted in discussion. Officers debated the risks of the plan, questioned the reliability of using disinformation, and raised concerns about operational security. Through it all, Irene noticed Admiral Whitmore watching her with a different expression than before, not mockery or dismissal, but something closer to professional assessment. When the discussion died down, Whitmore raised his hand. "General Keating, I'd like to propose something. Given my earlier misjudgment of Major Hill's capabilities, I think it would be appropriate for me to work directly with her on this investigation. My teams conduct regular security sweeps, and my authority could provide cover for more intensive scrutiny of the suspects." It was an olive branch, Irene recognized, but also a practical suggestion. Having a SEAL admiral involved would give her access to resources and authority that her cover identity couldn't provide. Keating looked at Irene. "Major, what do you think? Would Admiral Whitmore's involvement help or hinder your investigation?" Irene considered carefully. Working with Whitmore would be uncomfortable given what had just transpired, but he had valid points about resources and access. More importantly, having him as an ally rather than an obstacle could make the rest of her time at this facility significantly easier. "I think it could be beneficial, sir," she said finally. "But I need Admiral Whitmore to understand that while we'll be collaborating, this is my operation. I've spent 14 months building this case, and I won't have it compromised by anyone, regardless of rank." A hint of a smile crossed Whitmore's face. "Understood, Major. You're the lead. I'm just supporting personnel." Over the next hour, they hammered out the details of the plan. Irene would continue her cover as a civilian coordinator, but now she'd have Whitmore's security teams conducting routine inspections that would actually be gathering additional intelligence on the suspects. They'd plant the false information during a briefing scheduled for the following week, then monitor to see if it leaked. As the meeting concluded and officers began filing out, Irene gathered her materials and reached for Emma's lunchbox. She'd managed to forget about it during the briefing, so focused on the work that the embarrassing reminder of her morning chaos had faded into the background. "Major Hill." Whitmore approached her as the room emptied. "I wanted to speak with you privately if you have a moment." Irene nodded, curious about what he wanted to say away from General Keating's oversight. They moved to a corner of the now empty conference room. "I need you to understand something," Whitmore began, his voice low and serious. "What I said earlier, about single motherhood, about not belonging in positions of authority, that wasn't just ignorance or casual bias. It was cruel. I've served with plenty of parents, men and women both, who balanced family and military service. I had no excuse for treating you the way I did." Irene studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity but finding none. "Why did you, then?" Whitmore was quiet for a moment, clearly wrestling with the question. "Honestly? I think seeing you show up late, flustered, carrying your daughter's lunch, it reminded me of my own failures. My marriage ended because I couldn't balance the demands of this job with family life. My kids barely know me. When I saw you apparently managing what I couldn't, my instinct was to diminish it, to convince myself that you weren't really doing serious military work." It was a surprisingly honest admission, and it gave Irene a different perspective on the Admiral's earlier behavior. "Admiral, I appreciate your honesty," Irene said carefully. "But you need to understand something too. Every day, I question whether I'm doing right by my daughter. Every missed bedtime, every school event I can't attend, every morning when I'm running late because childcare fell through, it all adds up. When you mocked me for that lunchbox, you were voicing every doubt and fear I already have about whether I can be both a good mother and a good officer." Whitmore's expression tightened. "I'm sorry. Truly. If there's anything I can do to make this right—" "There is," Irene interrupted. "You can make sure that the next time you see someone who doesn't fit your image of what a military professional looks like, you pause before making assumptions. You can use your influence to ensure that parents serving in this command aren't penalized for having families. And you can work with me on this investigation with genuine respect, not just because General Keating ordered you to. You have my word on all 3 counts, Whitmore said firmly. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Irene shook it. As they left the conference room together, Irene caught sight of her reflection in the glass doors. She still looked rumpled, still carried a pink lunchbox, still appeared to be exactly what Whitmore had assumed she was. But now everyone in that briefing room knew differently. The walk back to her office was surreal. Word of the confrontation in the conference room had already spread through the facility's informal communication networks. Officers who'd barely acknowledged her existence before now nodded respectfully as she passed. Support staff who'd treated her as just another civilian coordinator suddenly seemed uncertain how to interact with her. Lieutenant Sarah Kovacs, one of the facility's intelligence analysts, caught up with her in the hallway. Major Hill? I just heard what happened in the briefing. I wanted to apologize for how I've treated you. I assumed you were just pushing papers, and I dismissed several of your suggestions about security protocols as civilian overreach. Irene paused, recognizing Kovacs as one of the people who'd been particularly dismissive during their previous interactions. What suggestions specifically? Kovacs looked uncomfortable. 3 months ago, you recommended we change the timing of our classified document disposal to avoid pattern recognition. I told you that operational security wasn't your concern. 2 months ago, you suggested we rotate our communication encryption keys more frequently. I said you didn't understand the technical requirements. Last month, you noticed that support staff had unsupervised access to secure areas during shift changes. I told you that you were being paranoid. All 3 of those recommendations were based on intelligence I'd gathered about how our adversaries might exploit those vulnerabilities, Irene said quietly. Did you implement any of them? No, Kovacs admitted. And I'm beginning to think that was a mistake. You were seeing things the rest of us missed because we were too focused on conventional threats. Irene considered this. Kovacs was young, maybe 26, and clearly talented but inexperienced. Her dismissal had probably been more about insecurity than malice. It's not too late to implement those protocols. If you're willing to listen now, I have several other recommendations that could strengthen our security posture. I'd appreciate that, Major. And, thank you for not holding my previous attitude against me. As Kovacs walked away, Irene reflected on how quickly power dynamics could shift. This morning, she'd been invisible. Now, suddenly, people were seeking her expertise, apologizing for past dismissals, treating her opinions as valuable. It was vindicating, certainly, but also slightly hollow. Her knowledge and capabilities hadn't changed, only people's perception of them had. She reached her office, a small space tucked away in the administrative wing, and finally set down Emma's lunchbox. Her phone buzzed with a text from the daycare. Emma keeps asking if you remembered her lunch. Should we tell her you'll bring it at pickup? Irene smiled despite herself and typed back, tell her mommy had an interesting morning, but yes, I have her lunch safe and sound. The following week unfolded with a strange new dynamic at the facility. Irene maintained her civilian coordinator cover, but now there was an unspoken understanding among the senior staff about her true role. Admiral Whitmore kept his word, assigning security teams to conduct what appeared to be routine inspections but were actually gathering intelligence on the 12 suspects. Irene spent her days moving between administrative offices, conducting interviews that seemed mundane but were carefully designed to probe for inconsistencies. She met with Christine Weber, a German civilian contractor who handled document translation, and noted how the woman's financial troubles had mysteriously resolved themselves 3 months ago. She interviewed Sergeant Paul Hendricks, who'd been passed over for promotion twice and carried a barely concealed resentment toward the command structure. Each conversation added pieces to the puzzle, but the picture remained frustratingly incomplete. The leak was careful, methodical, and smart enough to avoid obvious patterns. Whoever was compromising their operations had been doing this long enough to develop sophisticated tradecraft. On Wednesday afternoon, Irene was reviewing personnel files in her office when Admiral Whitmore knocked on her door frame. "Major Hill, do you have a moment?" She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "What can I do for you, Admiral?" "I've been going through the security sweep data from my teams," he said, spreading several folders on her desk. "We found something interesting. 3 of your suspects, Weber, Hendricks, and Lieutenant Keller, all have access to the same secure server room during overlapping time periods. It's not unusual individually, but the pattern suggests they might all be in the same physical space at specific times." Irene pulled up her timeline analysis. The major leaks occurred within 48 hours of large briefings. If someone needed to photograph documents or copy files, they'd need unsupervised access to classified materials immediately after those briefings when the information is still fresh and detailed. "Exactly," Whitmore agreed. "The server room has minimal surveillance during shift changes. Someone with the right access badge could spend 15 minutes there without raising red flags." They worked together for the next hour, cross-referencing access logs with leak timings. The analysis revealed something troubling. All 3 suspects had been in the server room within 12 hours of every major leak. But rather than narrowing their investigation, it complicated it. Could they be working together? Whitmore wondered aloud. 3 people collaborating to compartmentalize risk? "It's possible," Irene said slowly. "But intelligence operations rarely work that way. Too many potential points of failure. More likely, we're looking at one primary actor and 2 red herrings whose presence is coincidental." Her phone buzzed with a message from Emma's school. She glanced at it quickly. "Parent-teacher conference tomorrow at 3 p.m. Please confirm attendance." Whitmore noticed her distraction. "Problem?" "Just the eternal juggling act," Irene replied, typing a quick response. "Emma's teacher wants to meet tomorrow afternoon. Same time we have the briefing scheduled where we're planting the false intelligence. Can you reschedule the conference?" Irene shook her head. "I've already rescheduled twice because of operational demands. If I cancel again, Emma's teacher will start questioning my commitment to my daughter's education. Which, frankly, I question myself most days." Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "What if I attended the briefing as your representative? I could observe who accesses the information and report back to you afterward." It was a generous offer, and one that acknowledged the reality of her situation. "Admiral, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he interrupted. "But I'm trying to be better about recognizing that good officers sometimes have obligations outside the military. Besides, you've done the hard analytical work. I can handle watching who takes notes during a briefing." Irene studied him, looking for any sign that this was performative, a show of support that masked resentment. But Whitmore's expression was genuine. "Thank you, Admiral. I appreciate that." "There's something else," Whitmore said, his tone shifting slightly. "I've been thinking about what you said about making this facility more accommodating for parents. I spoke with General Keating about establishing better childcare support and flexible scheduling for personnel with family obligations. He's interested in piloting a program." "That would make a real difference," Irene said quietly. "Not just for me, but for a lot of people who feel like they have to choose between service and family." Thursday afternoon found Irene sitting in a too-small chair in Emma's classroom, surrounded by colorful artwork and alphabet posters. Emma's teacher, Frau Schneider, was a kind woman in her 50s who took her role seriously, sometimes too seriously for Irene's comfort. "Emma is doing well academically," Frau Schneider began, pulling out a folder of Emma's work. "Her reading comprehension is above grade level, and her math skills are excellent. But I'm concerned about her emotional state." Irene felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of concerns?" "She's become withdrawn during free play periods. The other children invite her to join games, but she often sits alone, drawing pictures. When I ask her about it, she says she's practicing being quiet so she doesn't disturb you when you're working." The words hit like a physical blow. Irene had known her job affected Emma, how could it not, but hearing it articulated by someone else made it painfully real. "I didn't realize she felt that way." "I don't think she's unhappy," Frau Schneider clarified. "But she's taking on emotional burdens that 6-year-olds shouldn't carry." She worries about you, about whether you're eating enough, about whether you're lonely when she's at school. These are concerns a child shouldn't have to think about. Irene blinked back tears. After Daniel died, she'd tried so hard to be both parents, to make sure Emma never felt the absence of her father. But in doing so, she'd inadvertently made Emma feel responsible for her mother's well-being. What can I do? Irene asked. How do I help her? Be present when you can be, Frau Schneider said gently. Not just physically, but emotionally. Emma doesn't need perfect, she needs genuine. She needs to see you take care of yourself, have joy in your life, be something other than just her mother and just a soldier. As Irene drove back to the base afterward, Frau Schneider's words echoed in her mind. She'd been so focused on being strong for Emma, on proving that she could handle everything, that she'd forgotten to let Emma see her be human. She arrived at the facility just as the briefing was concluding. Admiral Whitmore met her in the hallway outside the conference room, his expression troubled. How did it go? Irene asked. The briefing went exactly as planned. We presented the false intelligence about a high-value target in Sector 9, scheduled for next Tuesday. 37 people were present, including all 3 of our primary suspects. But? Irene prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. But I observed something unexpected. After the briefing ended, Lieutenant Keller approached me privately. He said he needed to discuss a sensitive matter and asked if we could meet in my office tomorrow morning. Irene's mind raced through possibilities. Did he give any indication what it was about? None. But his body language was off, nervous, conflicted. It could be unrelated to our investigation, or... Whitmore trailed off. Or he's our leak and he's about to confess, Irene finished. Or he suspects someone else and wants to report it. Either way, we need to be prepared for that meeting. They spent the next 2 hours planning for various scenarios. If Keller was confessing, they needed to ensure his statement was properly documented. If he was reporting someone else, they needed to verify his information without revealing the full scope of their investigation. If it was unrelated, they couldn't afford to show their hand. I want to be there, Irene said finally. Hidden, listening. Your office has that observation room from when it was used for security interviews. I can monitor from there. Whitmore nodded. Agreed. Whatever Keller wants to discuss, we'll handle it together. That evening, Irene picked up Emma from daycare and made a conscious decision to follow Frau Schneider's advice. Instead of heading straight home to work on case files, she stopped at a park. Why are we stopping, Mama? Emma asked as Irene unbuckled her from her car seat. Because it's a beautiful afternoon and I want to play with my daughter, Irene replied, taking Emma's hand. No work, no phone, just us. They spent an hour on the playground, Irene pushing Emma on the swings and catching her at the bottom of the slide. For 60 precious minutes, she wasn't Major Irene Hill conducting a classified investigation. She was just Emma's mother, laughing and playing and being fully present. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and mounting tension. Irene arrived at the facility early, entering through a side entrance to avoid being seen. She made her way to the observation room adjacent to Admiral Whitmore's office, a small space with a one-way mirror that had been installed years ago for security interviews. Whitmore was already in his office, reviewing notes. Through the mirror, Irene could see him preparing, straightening papers on his desk with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he understood the stakes of this meeting. At precisely 0900 hours, there was a knock on Whitmore's door. Come in, he called. Lieutenant David Keller entered, looking exactly as Whitmore had described, nervous and conflicted. He was 32, a signals intelligence specialist who'd been with the facility for 18 months. His record was exemplary, with nothing to suggest he'd compromise operational security. Thank you for meeting with me, Admiral, Keller said, taking the offered seat. I know you're busy. Not at all, Lieutenant. You said this was sensitive. How can I help? Keller was silent for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to begin. Finally, he said, Sir, I need to report something that's been happening at this facility. Something I should have reported months ago. Whitmore's expression remained neutral. Go on. 3 months ago, I noticed irregularities in our server access logs. Files being accessed during off hours, duplications of classified materials that shouldn't have been copied, pattern anomalies that suggested someone was systematically reviewing operational data they shouldn't have clearance for. Irene leaned closer to the mirror, her heart racing. This was it, confirmation that their leak was real and that Keller had noticed it. Why didn't you report this immediately? Whitmore asked. Because I thought I was wrong, Keller admitted. I'm relatively junior, and I didn't want to accuse anyone without being absolutely certain. So I started monitoring more carefully, documenting what I found. And the more I documented, the more certain I became that someone in this facility is compromising classified information. Do you know who? Keller pulled out a tablet and set it on Whitmore's desk. I've narrowed it to 2 possibilities, but I can't be certain which one. That's why I'm coming to you now. I need someone with authority to investigate properly. Whitmore picked up the tablet, and Irene could see him scrolling through what appeared to be detailed logs and analysis. After a moment, he looked up at Keller with newfound respect. This is impressive work, Lieutenant. Very thorough. Walk me through your reasoning. For the next 20 minutes, Keller detailed his investigation. He explained how he'd noticed that Christine Weber, the civilian translator, had access patterns that didn't match her work requirements. She was reviewing files in English that didn't need translation, accessing documents outside her normal duty hours, and downloading materials to encrypted drives that weren't part of standard protocols. But there's another possibility, Keller continued. Sergeant Hendricks has been exhibiting similar patterns, though less obviously. He's been accessing personnel files and operational summaries that fall outside his area of responsibility. His access times correlate with the periods when I've noticed unusual server activity. Whitmore studied the data. If you had to choose one, who would you say is more likely? Keller hesitated. Weber. The pattern is more consistent, and she has financial motivations. But I can't rule out Hendricks, or even the possibility that they're working together. From her position in the observation room, Irene was rapidly assessing this new information. Keller's analysis aligned with her own findings but added technical details she hadn't been able to access. More importantly, his willingness to come forward suggested he wasn't the leak. Lieutenant, I need to be honest with you, Whitmore said carefully. You're not the only one who's noticed these irregularities. There's been an ongoing investigation into security breaches at this facility, and your observations align with what we found. Keller's eyes widened. There's already an investigation? Sir, if I've compromised. You haven't compromised anything, Whitmore assured him. In fact, your independent analysis helps confirm our findings. But I need to ask, have you discussed your suspicions with anyone else? No, sir. I wasn't sure who to trust, so I kept it to myself while I gathered evidence. Whitmore made a decision. What I'm about to tell you is classified. There's an intelligence officer who's been investigating these leaks for over a year. She's been working under civilian cover, gathering information without alerting the suspects. She? Keller looked confused. Who? The door to the observation room opened, and Irene stepped out, entering Whitmore's office from the connecting hallway. Keller turned, recognition dawning on his face. Ms. Hill? Keller stared at her in confusion. I don't understand. You're the civilian coordinator. Actually, I'm Major Irene Hill, Army Intelligence, she said, showing him her credentials. I've been conducting the investigation Admiral Whitmore mentioned. Your analysis is excellent, Lieutenant. It confirms and expands on what I've been documenting. Keller looked between Irene and Whitmore, clearly trying to process this revelation. You've been undercover this whole time? But that means, all those times I saw you in the administrative areas, you were actually investigating? Exactly, Irene confirmed. She sat down across from him. Your technical analysis is more detailed than what I've been able to access. My cover didn't give me reason to request server logs without raising suspicion. But combined with my behavioral observations and your technical evidence, we can build a stronger case. So Weber is our leak? Keller asked. We believe so, but we need proof, Irene explained. Which is where you come in. We've planted false intelligence in the system, a fake operation scheduled for next week. If Weber accesses and leaks that information, we'll have confirmation and can move to apprehend her. Keller processed this. And you need me to monitor the server activity to track if she accesses the false intelligence? Precisely, Whitmore said. But you'll need to do it carefully. If Weber suspects she's being watched, she might go to ground before we can catch her. I can do that, Keller said confidently. I've been monitoring her access patterns for months without her knowing. A few more days won't be a problem. Over the next hour, they coordinated their approach. Keller would continue his technical surveillance while Irene maintained her civilian cover and conducted what appeared to be routine administrative reviews. Whitmore would coordinate with General Keating to have military police standing by in case they needed to make an arrest quickly. As Keller left the office, Irene turned to Whitmore. We're close. If Weber takes the bait, we'll have everything we need to close this case. And if she doesn't? Then we keep digging, Irene replied. But I don't think we'll need to. Weber's been operating for months without suspicion. She's gotten comfortable, maybe even overconfident. That's when people make mistakes. The rest of Friday passed with agonizing slowness. Irene maintained her normal routine, conducting inventory reviews and filing reports, all while knowing that somewhere in the facility, Christine Weber might be accessing the false intelligence they'd planted. Every time her phone buzzed, she expected it to be Keller confirming that Weber had taken the bait. But the confirmation didn't come Friday. Or Saturday. By Sunday evening, as Irene was reading bedtime stories to Emma, she began to wonder if their plan had failed. Maybe Weber was more cautious than they'd anticipated. Maybe she'd sensed something was wrong and decided to lay low. Then, at 2,247 hours on Sunday night, her secure phone rang. It was Keller, his voice tight with excitement. Major Hill, she just accessed the files. Weber downloaded the complete operational plan for the fake mission, including target coordinates and timing. It's all documented in the logs. Irene felt a rush of vindication mixed with grim satisfaction. Good work, Lieutenant. Don't make any moves yet. We wait to see if the information appears in our intercepts. If it does, we'll know for certain she's actively passing it to hostile parties. Understood, Major. I'll keep monitoring. Irene ended the call and sat in the darkness of her living room, listening to Emma's peaceful breathing from the bedroom down the hall. After 14 months of careful investigation, of enduring dismissal and mockery, of balancing impossible demands while maintaining her cover, they were finally closing in on their target. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow we end this. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, the sun bright over Stuttgart as Irene dropped Emma at school. Have a good day, sweetheart, she said, kissing her daughter's forehead. You too, Mama, Emma replied, then added quietly, are you doing important work today? Irene knelt down to her daughter's level. Yes, but nothing is more important than you. Remember that, okay? Emma smiled and ran toward her classroom. Irene watched her go, thinking about Frau Schneider's words about being present, about letting Emma see her as more than just a soldier or a mother. After today, maybe she could find better balance. At the facility, tension ran high among those who knew what was happening. General Keating had arrived early, coordinating with military police who were positioned discreetly around the building. Admiral Whitmore was in his office, maintaining normal operations while staying ready to act. Lieutenant Keller monitored the servers from his station, watching for any additional suspicious activity. Irene sat at her desk in the administrative wing, surrounded by the mundane paperwork that had been her cover for 14 months. Anyone watching would see the same civilian coordinator they'd always dismissed, filing reports and updating inventory logs. None of them could see the secure tablet hidden beneath her regular paperwork, displaying real-time updates from Keller and the intelligence intercept team. At 1034 hours, the message came through, intercept confirmed. False intelligence appeared in hostile communications at 1027 hours. Source matches previous leak patterns. It's definitely Weber. Irene's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. She stood, gathered her files, and walked casually toward Christine Weber's office in the translation department. Admiral Whitmore and a military police team were already moving into position through different corridors, coordinating their approach to avoid alerting Weber. Weber's office was in a quiet corner of the administrative building, away from the main operational areas, perfect for someone who wanted privacy for illicit activities. Irene knocked on the door, her demeanor friendly and professional. "Christine? Do you have a moment? I need to verify some document timestamps for the quarterly audit." Weber looked up from her computer, her expression showing mild annoyance but nothing that suggested alarm. "Sure, come in. Though I'm pretty busy this morning." "This won't take long," Irene assured her, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Through the window, she could see Whitmore and two MPs taking positions in the hallway. She sat across from Weber and pulled out her tablet, pretending to reference audit information. "I've been reviewing document access logs, and I noticed some irregularities. Files accessed outside normal duty hours, duplications that don't match standard protocols. Can you explain those?" Weber's expression shifted slightly, wariness creeping into her eyes. "I sometimes work late to catch up. Nothing unusual about that." "No, there isn't," Irene agreed. "But what is unusual is accessing classified operational plans that have nothing to do with translation work. Plans that subsequently appeared in hostile intelligence communications." The color drained from Weber's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Irene set down her tablet and pulled out her actual credentials. "Major Irene Hill, United States Army Intelligence." "Christine Weber, you're being detained on suspicion of espionage and unauthorized disclosure of classified information." The door opened, and Admiral Whitmore entered with the military police. Weber looked between them, her expression cycling through shock, fear, and finally resignation. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Irene replied. "Long enough to document every leak, every access violation, every piece of classified information you sold. Including the false intelligence we fed you yesterday specifically to confirm you were our source." Weber slumped in her chair. "I needed the money. My mother's medical bills, the debt, they offered so much for so little information." "So little?" Whitmore's voice was hard. "You compromised operations that put soldiers' lives at risk. You betrayed the trust of everyone in this facility. There's nothing little about what you did." As the military police escorted Weber away, Irene felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the investigation was finally over. Satisfaction that they caught the leak before it caused casualties. But also a strange emptiness, knowing that 14 months of her life had been dedicated to catching someone driven by desperation rather than ideology. General Keating appeared in the doorway. "Outstanding work, Major Hill. Your investigation was thorough, your tradecraft impeccable, and your patience remarkable. I'm recommending you for commendation." "Thank you, sir," Irene replied. "Though I couldn't have closed it without Lieutenant Keller's technical analysis and Admiral Whitmore's support." Keating nodded. "All of which will be noted in my report. Now, I believe you have some administrative matters to conclude before we can officially end your cover assignment. Take the time you need." The facility felt different in the days following Weber's arrest. Word spread quickly about the investigation, about Irene's true identity, and about how the dismissed civilian coordinator had actually been running one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in the theater. The transformation in how people treated her was immediate and profound. Officers who'd barely acknowledged her existence now sought her expertise on security protocols. Support staff who'd treated her as invisible suddenly remembered every interaction differently. Even the civilian contractors approached her with newfound respect mixed with nervousness, wondering if they'd been under investigation too. On Thursday afternoon, General Keating called a special formation in the main courtyard. The entire facility gathered, hundreds of personnel standing in neat ranks under the bright German sun. Irene stood at the front in her dress uniform, wearing her actual rank insignia for the first time in 14 months. Major Irene Hill, Keating announced, his voice carrying across the assembled formation, has spent the past 14 months conducting a classified counterintelligence operation that resulted in the identification and apprehension of a hostile intelligence asset. Her work prevented the compromise of multiple special operations and potentially saved countless lives. He pinned a commendation medal to her uniform, then stepped back and saluted. The entire formation followed suit, hundreds of hands snapping to salutes in recognition of her service. Afterward, as the formation dispersed, Admiral Whitmore approached her. "That was well earned, Major. I hope you know how much respect you've gained here." From some people, Irene replied with a slight smile. Others are probably just relieved I wasn't investigating them. Whitmore laughed. "Fair point. Listen, I wanted you to know that General Keating approved the family support program we discussed. Better childcare facilities, flexible scheduling, policies that acknowledge soldiers have lives outside their uniforms. You helped make that happen. That means more to me than the medal," Irene said honestly. "If my experience here helps even one parent serve without sacrificing their relationship with their children, it was worth it." That evening, Irene picked up Emma from school for the last time as a civilian coordinator. Starting Monday, she'd be transitioning to a new assignment, still in intelligence, but without the demanding cover identity that had required her to hide who she really was. "Mama, Frau Schneider said you did something brave at work," Emma said as they drove home. "What did you do?" Irene thought about how to explain 14 months of investigation, espionage, and sacrifice to a 6-year-old. "I caught someone who was doing something wrong. It took a long time, and I had to be very patient, but eventually I was able to stop them." "Like a detective?" "Exactly like a detective," Irene confirmed, smiling at the comparison. "Are you going to do more detective work?" "Probably, but different kinds. And I'll be home more, I promise. No more late nights, no more missing bedtimes." Emma was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Was it hard? Being a detective and being my mama?" Irene felt tears prick at her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But you made it possible. Every time I felt like giving up, I thought about you and it gave me strength to keep going." The following week, Lieutenant Keller received a commendation for his technical analysis. The security protocols Irene had recommended months ago, the ones that had been dismissed as civilian overreach, were finally implemented. And Admiral Whitmore began conducting training sessions on unconscious bias and the importance of not dismissing personnel based on appearance or circumstances. 3 months later, Irene received a letter from Christine Weber, now awaiting trial. In it, Weber apologized for her actions and thanked Irene for treating her with dignity during the arrest. She wrote that she'd been expecting judgment and contempt but had instead encountered professionalism and even a degree of compassion. Irene never responded to the letter, but she kept it as a reminder that the people she investigated were human, driven by complex motivations that weren't always pure evil. Understanding that didn't excuse their actions, but it helped her maintain perspective in a job that could easily become cynical. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, 6 months after the investigation concluded, Irene sat on a blanket in the same park where she'd played with Emma after her meeting with Frau Schneider. Emma was on the swings, laughing with friends from school, no longer sitting alone and practicing being quiet. Admiral Whitmore appeared, walking across the park with a small boy who Irene recognized from photographs as his son. "Major Hill. Mind if we join you?" "Not at all, Admiral." They sat together, watching their children play, 2 officers who'd started as adversaries and become something closer to friends through shared understanding of how difficult it was to balance duty and family. "You changed this facility," Whitmore said quietly. "Not just by catching Weber, but by forcing us to confront our assumptions about who soldiers are and what they're capable of. That's a legacy that will outlast any single investigation. Irene smiled, watching Emma soar higher on the swings. I just proved what I always knew: strength comes in different forms. Sometimes the smallest person in the room is carrying the heaviest burden. And sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.